Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to your Lake Fork. Got another episode of the Guides Network. Every year we get to fall bass fishing and plastic worms really come into play. One of the oldest techniques, and maybe the technique that's caught more fish than all other techniques combined, is a Texas rig plastic worm. Today I'm going to give you all the latest and greatest tips and techniques to help you guys catch more fish on Texas rig plastic worms. All right, guys, let's talk about Texas rig plastic worms. But right before we do that, let me get a couple shameless plugs in. I apologize. This is part of my gig, though. I got to sell a little product when I do these videos. It is kind of my job. So, I want to talk to you about Waterland Eyewear. I've been wearing these sunglasses right here all year. The best, hands down, the best copolymer lenses I've ever put on my face. The price point's unbelievable when you look at comparable glasses that are available on the market today. Go check them out at waterlandco.com. Find a frame style you like and order them up. When you do, you punch in that code, your Lake Fork Guide, you'll get 10% off of your glasses and get the best eyewear deal in the fishing market today. Also, 6censfishing.com. Every single thing that I'm going to talk about for fishing Texas rig plastic worms today, I'm getting from 6censfishing.com besides my lose reels. Lose reels are awesome. We'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. Talk about the type of reels I use for Texas rigging. But my rod, my weights, my hooks, even my plastics now are coming from 6censfishing.com. If you go there and order some of this equipment up, you can also use that same code, your Lake Fork Guide, to get that same 10% discount on anything you order there as well. All right, so let's talk about what equipment are we gonna need to fish a Texas rig plastic worm. It's gotta start with a rod. Probably the most important piece of equipment, maybe the hook, but the rod is certainly right up there. When you're talking about a technique, as you'll see later, where you're dragging it so slow and putting it in heavy cover, and sometimes the bite can be very subtle, you're gonna need a super sensitive rod. The 6 Sense Sensory Series is the lightest, most sensitive rod I've ever fished in my life. I promise any of you guys buy this rod, you will be blown away when you put it in your hands the first time. I will guarantee you that. That is my guarantee. In fact, if you buy a Sensory rod and you don't like it, you just send me a message. I'll buy it from you because I can't have enough of them. I love them. 7.3 heavy is the model that I like to use for Texas rigging. These rods, again, they're so extremely light. 7.3 heavy might be a little bit heavier than I would throw in some other lines of rods with a light Texas rig, say a 1/4 ounce type Texas rig. But in this case, the rod being this light, it handles the lighter baits very, very well. And I have the added bonus of having that additional power. Certainly don't have any sensitivity issues with these Sensory Series rods. The reel that I'm using a Lew's Hyper Mag 7-to-1 gear ratio reel. You know, reel preference is one thing. I love this Lew's Hyper Mag. It's super smooth. This one is old as heck. This one's a couple years old now. It's been on hundreds of guide trips and filming days, and this reel still casts like butter, still reels every fish in, as you guys will see today. Now let's get down to the actual Texas rig itself. It's gonna look something like this. You're gonna have for this time of year, I'll tell you what, scratch that. Before we get started on this equipment, this time of year, guys, man, we got some thunder around us, John.
Yeah.
So this time of year in the fall, and we'll talk about this a little bit more specifically here in a minute, but I really like a 1/4 ounce Texas rig. That's going to be a 1/4 ounce tungsten. This is going to be a 6 Sense stout wide gap hook in the 4/0 size. You could go 5/0 on these big ribbon tails. Really need to cater the hook to the size of bait that you're going to throw. Now, one thing that I want to show, John, are you close to being in? Reel in for me real quick. There's a time to peg and a time not to peg. I've been fishing an unpegged Texas rig today, and John has been fishing a pegged Texas rig. See, he's got that little bobber stop right there. That's going to keep the weight from sliding up and down. It's going to keep the weight attached to the head of the bait. What that does is when you peg that weight on there, it makes it more weedless. So when you're fishing a thick brush pile offshore, when you're fishing super dense flooded bushes flipping up in the heavy cover up shallow, having your weight pegged is going to keep that bait and weight connected and going to make it more weedless. When you don't have it connected, what can happen in heavy cover is the weight can fall away from the bait, allowing your plastic to get hung on an edge, which will then bunch your plastic down, which will then cause you to get hung up, as you can see there. So, and that's just my soft round finger. You can imagine on the hard edge of a branch or something like that. That being said, when you're fishing a ribbon tail worm specifically, and we'll talk about why we're fishing ribbon tail here in a minute. When you're fishing a ribbon tail worm specifically, or really any bait that has swimming appendages, having that weight fall away from the bait is going to get you more bites. It creates a change of speed. It's like when you're fishing a crankbait and you hit something hard and the crankbait deflects, you get that big reaction bite. Having your bait unpegged does the same thing, because when the bait first hits the water, it falls real fast, falls the same speed as the weight. And as the weight slides away, when the weight finally hits the ground and bottoms out, this bait will be falling as fast as the weight and then stop and drift down real slow. It creates that sudden change of pace, not necessarily a change in direction like a deflection on the crankbait does, but it gives it that sudden stop and change of pace and hangs in their face a little bit longer. And it really does, when you fish a Texas rig unpegged, you on a ribbon tail or a swimming bait, you will 100% get more bites. Every time, guaranteed. You'll also get hung up more. If you guys watched the video with me and John Monday, I don't know how many times you guys are going to see me get hung up, but John can back me up on this. I got more bites than John today, but I also got hung up a lot more than John today because we were fishing brush. It takes a very experienced angler to take an unpegged Texas rig and offshore brush and get it through there without hanging up too much, as John hangs up his pegged one right now. Perfect timing. Obviously, when you're fishing heavy cover, you can't hang up anything, but John came right out, right, John? Came right out with that peg, whereas I had to go get it a couple times today. But again, I got more bites. And if you don't have experience working a bait through timber and getting it unhung and working it through that brush, then you're really going to spend a lot of your time until you get used to it fetching your bait, getting on top of your fish and messing up your brush piles. So it's something you have to personally weigh and decide on what you want to do there. If I had guide customers that I was unfamiliar with in the boat, 100,000% fishing offshore brush, my Texas rig would be pegged at all times. Old school ribbon tail worms, just straight Berkeley power worm that probably most of us, the majority of us, it was probably the first bait we ever threw bass fishing was a ribbon tail worm. For whatever reason, now we've got all these new baits. We've got creature baits, we've got brush hogs, we've got, Cincos, we've got just unbelievable amounts of plastic options out there, and they've all been created for a reason, and they all kind of are a better version of a plastic worm in certain situations. But in this region that we live in right here around Lake Fork, for whatever reason, when you get to late September and in throughout the month of October, every single year, they bite that old school ribbon tail worm better than anything else on a Texas rig that time of year. For what, I don't know, I can't explain it. Now, as I said, all those other baits are like an evolution of a plastic worm that make them perform better in certain situations, whatever it may be. Sixth Sense has kind of outdone themselves once again and created something called the ridge worm. Essentially, this is a ribbon tail worm, but it doesn't have the curled up tail. It's got a flat tail, but the whole tail still swims just like a ribbon tail. And I've been catching fish lately on a regular 7 or 8 inch ribbon tail worm. I came out here today and I fished this ridge worm offshore on shaky heads throughout the summer, did really well on it. Came out here today, fished it up mid-depth and shallow and did really well on it, using it for the same pattern I normally would be using a ribbon tail worm for right now. This bait hammered down on him. In fact, John, after a little while, he had to get him one on too, and he's been fishing it all day, and every fish we caught today except for one was caught on this brand new ridge worm. It's a very unique action that fish have not seen yet. You can see how flat that tail is. It gives it a big long swimming action, big long undulating action in the water. When you see it in the water, it's absolutely beautiful. You can tell right away it's going to get their attention, and it catches bigs. Like we saw today, it catches bigs. We've been out here fishing for about 3 hours now, and we've got a 23-pound best 5 at a tough time of year. with sunny to cloudy, back sunny again, back cloudy. Like we've had changing, everything's kind of working against us. We just got through with turnover. Like we got a lot of things going against us right now. And this worm still came out here and caught several big fish for us today. So a Texas rig and a worm, just a regular straight swimming ribbon tail type worm this time of year is the way to go. B, try these ridge worms. It's a different look these fish haven't seen, and I'm telling y'all, you won't be disappointed. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the type of areas that you're going to want to throw this Texas rig ribbon tail worm in. Something like we fished today is absolutely ideal. We've got a giant grass flat behind us that these fish can spread out on during the turnover when the oxygen gets low. Now that the turnover is kind of wrapping up, a few of them are pulling back out to the first piece of obvious cover. This is a great place, a great place. Any type of gathering spot relatively close to shallow water is exactly where you want to throw these Texas rig worms. We've got a brush pile on the edge of a shallow creek channel. The brush pile's in like 4 or 5 foot. The creek channel's a little bit deeper than that. That is a perfect spot. It's a big, big brush pile, and it's gathering these fish as they pull off that flat and start to gather again. It's a stop sign for a few of them to stay on for a little while. Another place that can be very productive is gonna be boat docks. As fish start to gather back up, they'll gather on some of these boat docks that are positioned very close to big shallow flats. That's what you want to look for. These fish are still in a transition mode between summer and fall right now, and you really want to look for what I like to call a stop sign close to these shallow water areas. Creek channel swings that are heavily lined with timber or brush like we fished today can be great. Brush piles themselves can be great. Boat docks can be great. You want some type of piece of dynamic cover adjacent to the shallow water. That is what I'm really focused on this time of year when I'm wanting to fish this Texas rig worm. The other thing that you can kind of key in on, and it doesn't seem right because this doesn't look anything like a shad, obviously this looks nothing like a shad, but these areas that are going to hold the fish, the best stop signs, they're not only going to be stop signs for bass, they're going to be stop signs for shad as well. And you're going to visibly see shad flicking and popping on the surface this time of year when the shad are gathered in an area. So if you find a dynamic piece of cover and then you find a massive amount of bait fish kind of clicking and popping, you're seeing steady signs of bait fish in that area, that's going to be, man, virtually a guarantee that you can catch some fish on a worm this time of year when you see all that. All right, so that's it, guys. I'm going to get up and show you guys how I work this bait, how I retrieve it. Actually, I can let John do that while I talk you through it. Actually, we'll just let John do that while I'm talking you through it. And it is the simplest bait to fish. It's why most of us started with one. It's the simplest bait to fish, but man, is it effective. And I'm going to mix in some highlights of some catches, and every fish that you're going to see in this video is a fish that we caught today on the ridge worm from 6 Cents Fishing. So first thing you're going to notice, John made a real long cast. These fish this time of year can tend to be a little bit more lethargic, a little bit more less apt to bite. And so you do want to keep your boat as far away from as possible. So once you've got your dynamic piece of structure marked, your brush pile, your dock, you want to start fishing as far away from them as you can and still get your bait in the area you're wanting to fish. So a long cast is going to be very important. Now John's up there and he is dragging straight up, I'm assuming, more or less. Yeah. John's reeling down the slack, pointing the rod out, and then dragging it up slowly, feeling for cover. Every once in a while you can shake it, especially with this ridge worm, right? Give it just a little light, subtle shake. Make that tail kind of flop a little bit, and then let it fall and sit. If you're in that brush pile and you feel yourself, as soon as you climb that limb, you can kind of feel the tension from the limb as that bait comes up to it, right? So that bait's gonna be climbing, you're gonna be pulling it up like John's doing. It's gonna be coming up, you can feel the tension. As soon as it pops over, and you feel that release where that bait starts to fall, point your rod down and let it fall straight down in that brush. That's an important factor. A lot of times your bite will come right as it comes over a branch, right as it comes over some type of piece of cover. If you'll point your rod down and make it fall straight down, that weight will get away from that bait, that weight will hit the bottom, then that bait will slow down, and that's where you're gonna get your bite a lot of the times. When it comes time to set a hook, as you guys are seeing in some of the footage we're rolling over here, when you're lifting up and you feel that bite, it's so important that you take your time and don't get in too much of a hurry. So as I'm lifting up, boom, I feel a bite. I'm gonna point my rod down, reel up on my slack, feel for that fish. If I still feel the tension or I feel that fish swimming or biting it at all, at this point I'm gonna set the hook as hard as I can to my right shoulder, as you guys are seeing in some of these hook sets that I'm rolling over here from today. And then once you got that big hook set, man, just get after them. You know, I didn't say it earlier, but I'm fishing this on 20-pound fluorocarbon line. I've got that 7.3 heavy action rod. I can really take control of even big fish doing that. The only time you don't pull real hard is, you saw today, we got hung up in the brush a couple times. And when you get hung up in the brush, it's important to keep your rod bent, but kind of ease up on them and try to let them swim away. It's a really hard thing for me to articulate and verbalize for you to understand. It's something that I really need to show you in person to teach you correctly. But what you're trying to do when you set the hook and that fish gets hung up in brush, you want to let him have some line, but you don't want your rod to ever lose all of its bend. So if your rod's bent this much, you want to let it bend this much and kind of let that fish have the ability to swim away from that brush. And a lot of times he'll come out. And on my first big fish I caught today, my big one, I had to let him do that multiple times to get my line free from the brush. So stay calm, don't panic, stay patient, and try to let that fish swim away from the brush without letting your rod go straight or your line get slack, and you'll get 99% of them out of the brush if you do it like that. They do not want to be pegged up next to that brush. They're going to want to go away from it if you'll let them. John, how come you ain't caught no more? We done caught them all out of this hole?
Yeah, I think we wore our welcome out.
And we literally have lightning popping right over there. Y'all can hear the thunder in the background. We probably should be off the water at this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up and tell you guys, thank you so very much for tuning in today. I certainly hope some of these tips can help y'all catch some fish. I promise you, this is an easy technique that anybody can do, and it absolutely will get you some great quality bites for about the next month and a half. So get that Texas rig worm on there, buy some of those ridge worms, and go out and show them fish something they haven't seen, and go catch a bunch of bigs. Hey man, appreciate it, like I said, and we'll see y'all next time right here on your Lake Fork Guide. John, get me off this death trap before we both die. Let's go.